Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Uncomfortable Conversations that Ignite Change. My name is Joanna Deshay, and I have the great pleasure of serving as Executive Director of Diversity Leadership Alliance. This dialogue series that we created is all about listening and learning, and was really developed because we wanted these conversations to mean something. Our sole desire is for people to walk away feeling like they have some tools that they can use to begin to really have some soul healing and emotional repair. What we discovered was that in order for true progress to be made, it's going to take all of us. It's going to take every race. It's going to take every ethnicity, every culture, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and yes, political view. We don't have all of the answers now, but what we do have is this. We have this forum, this platform, and it serves as a safe place and a safe space where we, the community, can come together and connect in a meaningful way. Now, I know that today is especially difficult, and for a lot of us that do this work of social justice, and a lot of us that are activists, diversity practitioners, a little daunting because we woke up to a grand jury decision in the Breonna Taylor case that felt unfair. So for all of us that are here today, it is imperative that we stand firm and we forge forward with resilience and most importantly with hope, because our future, our kids, and the work that we must continue to do depends on it. So I encourage you to please stand strong, for there is much work still to be done. So today is dialogue number 3 in our series, and I'm very excited about the topic that we're going to talk about, which is so timely. It is all around the idea of micro and macroaggressions and the racial battle fatigue that many of us feel in the workplace. You're going to get a chance to meet Dr. Andrea Brownlee of Australia Mountain Community College. And Dr. Brownlee is going to walk you through racial microaggressions and how those over time lead to racial battle fatigue. And this is what happens when people of color spend large amounts of time in racially charged environments, and those environments become taxing psychologically, physiologically, behaviorally, and they eventually lead to becoming physically and mentally draining. In today's workshop, you are going to learn how to mitigate these micro and macroaggressions, and you're going to learn how to do so in positive and productive ways before they can lead to serious issues, any sort of morale dips, and any kind of an overall unhealthy work culture. So I invite you to get your pens out, right? Get your writing tools, that's very important, and get ready to take some notes because Dr. Brownlee is really going to share some wonderful insights with you. Before we begin, this is a community space, and what I want to do is remind you of the rules for engagement for this community space. So I want to just take a second to really go over the rules of engagement with you and just have you guys and invite you to please just make sure that we're all adhering to the rules. Rule number 1 is very simple. Listen actively and be open to the full spectrum of perspectives. Rule number 2, commit to foster greater empathy. Try to relinquish the need to be right. Ask questions. Dr. Brownlee is all about questions. He's open to that. So ask questions and seek clarification for understanding. Be respectful to the presenter and to other attendees on today's call. No one or 2 individuals should dominate a discussion, even in the chat area. So please be mindful of that. Make sure you are approaching each other with kindness and love. And the last one, Brent, if I could have you just scroll that up. The last one I just want to make sure we mention is that we do reserve the right, we're a community space, so we do reserve the right if in the discussion anyone is being disrespectful As a community space, we reserve the right to remove you from the discussion. So that is something I just wanted to mention. So if you are disruptive, this is all about learning. We're an education organization. We are not political. We're not an advocacy organization. So as an education organization, we ask everyone to be respectful. Okay, so that is what I wanted to make sure we mention. So let me just take a second and introduce you to today's presenter. Dr. Andrea Brownlee is an educator who has taught in the K-12 school system, has taught in community college and at a university for over a decade. He has attended and graduated from all 3 state schools, finally completing his doctorate from the University of Arizona. Dr. Brownlee, we won't hold that against you, but okay, ASU, but it's good. His passion is educating teachers in the art of meeting the holistic needs of students of color. An avid coffee drinker, originally from Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. Brownlee started his early career as a civil engineer, designing and building infrastructure projects and systems. Before Dr. Brownlee begins his presentation, we would like to start with a small clip from the Hulu drama miniseries based on the New York Times best-selling book of the same name. We invite you to watch this clip from Little Fires Everywhere. Give us just a second. Brent's going to get that up. Dr. Scholar's cueing the clip now.
Sorry about that. We're trying to get it on full screen. There we go. That's what I wanted. All right, everyone. Lights, camera, action. Oh, nope.
I'm sorry, why are you still here?
It's my job to be here, unless you'd rather I not be.
Did you think you were just gonna waltz into my house and pretend like nothing ever happened?
Elena, this isn't about you. It's not about me. It's about a child who belongs with her mother.
Exactly.
All right. Sorry about that. I don't know why people are not able to see today where we've done before, but welcome to technology. We will try it. We will not do full screen. We will just do share. And let's try now before I start. Joanna, can you give me a thumbs up? Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
All right. Sorry, we're not in full screen mode, everybody.
Her mother is Linda.
You and I are never gonna agree on this because we are very different people.
I agree. You're manipulative and deceitful, with no sense of the rules or consequences, just like your friend Bibi.
Okay, Elena.
I'm sorry, but someone has to say this to you. You know what else you have in common with your friend? You're both terrible mothers. I mean, honestly, it's a miracle that Pearl is as lovely and wonderful as she is.
It's not a miracle. She is mine, and I am a good mother.
Oh, really? Because in my book, a good mother puts her daughter's needs before her own. A good mother makes good choices. And she doesn't drag a child from town to town, school to school. She doesn't smoke marijuana. Just leave her daughter to fend for herself. And she really doesn't leave a baby alone in the cold in front of a fire station.
You didn't make good choices. You had good choices. Options that being rich and white and entitled gave you.
Again, that's the difference between you and me. I would never make this about race.
Elena, you made this about race when you stood out there in the street and begged me to be your maid.
This is not working out. I think this is going to be your last day.
You think?
Is this all just a plan with you and BB to worm your way into our lives to get to Mirabelle? Why did you even take this job?
I took this job to protect my kid.
From what?
From you.
I thought we were friends.
White women always want to be friends with their maid. I was not your maid, Elena, and I was never your friend.
Thank you so much, Brent. And without further ado, I would love to introduce you to Dr. Andrea Brownlee. Welcome, Dr. Brownlee. So good to have you with us here today.
I'm glad to be here. I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be able to share my experiences and share some scholarship. But before I move into my presentation, I want to make some comments about the Little Fires Everywhere video clip. The reason I selected that clip, because what we see in that clip, we do see various forms of micro and macroaggressions, but what I wanted to point out, which I kind of get into in the early parts of my presentation, is that macro and microaggressions are actually rooted in implicit biases, right? And so what we see between Mia, which is the Black woman, and Elena, which is the white woman, there's these implicit biases that are there. So there were some statements that were made within this. Number one, Elena tells Mia that she's a terrible mother. That's an implicit bias that's typically associated with Black women, single Black women, that because they don't have the traditional nucleus family, that they are bad mothers, number one. Number two, another statement was made because she was a drug user, that she smoked marijuana, that equated to her being a bad mother. Another statement that was made is because she moves all the time. Well, the reason she moves a lot is because Mia's an artist. And so the assumption is that she's actually poor. But when you read the book and watch the series, you understand that Mia actually has money. And so what Elena does, she goes to Mia and says, well, if you're looking for a job, you can be my maid. Why don't you be my maid? It's tied into these implicit biases. So the implicit bias of her being a poor single Black woman pulls on the heartstrings of Elena and leads to these microaggressions and even macroaggressions towards Mia. And so what I want to highlight is at the end, when Elena approaches Mia and questions her decisions, Mia makes it very clear. It's not that you made right decisions. Decisions were made for you because you have this privilege. And when Mia brings up race, Elena's response is, well, the difference between me and you, I would never bring race into the conversation. But her implicit biases are rooted in race, and she doesn't even know that. So that's why I want to start off this conversation with that video clip of that series, and it's a very great series. So I'm gonna transition into my presentation today. The name of my presentation is Micro and Macroaggressions and Racial Battle Fatigue: How Minoritized People Feel in the Workplace and How to Navigate These Hostile Spaces. Once again, I'm Dr. Andrea Brownlee. I work currently at Australia Mountain Community College as an analyst advisor and an adjunct professor. And also I am an adjunct professor at Arizona State University. So even though I graduated from U of A, Joanna, I still work at you. All right, so I got some redemption qualities in there, right?
Thank you.
All right. So I want to talk about the objectives for today. So after today, we'll be able to define microaggressions and macroaggressions through definitions, visual examples, and participation. We want to examine the impact of microaggressions and macroaggressions on the body over periods of time. We want to review fatigue leads to MEES and RBF being racial battle fatigue, and MEES stands for mundane extreme environmental stress. Then I want to question, where do you stand? Are you a bystander? Are you an aggressor? Are you an ally? Or are you a target? And then I want to use case studies at the end to review these micro interventions that we're going to use as a form of self-care. All right, so we're gonna have some working language today, And so what I realized in doing presentations, a lot of times we'll assume that people understand certain terminology, but when you use certain terminology like diversity, there's like a cornucopia of actually definitions you can use. And so what I wanted to do is kind of set the tone with some working language to say, you know, this means this and that means that. So throughout the presentation, you're going to see me introduce working language. So if you want to, you can write it down or watch the video clip later to write the definitions. There are multiple definitions for structural racism, race, and etc. So I just want to make sure that we understand in this context what these terms actually mean. This is the sequence of the presentation today, or the flow of the presentations. On the first quarter, I'm going to be talking about microaggressions and macroaggressions as well. I'm going to be talking about MEES, mundane extreme environmental stress. I'm going to be talking about racial battle fatigue, and then we'll get into micro interventions and how can we use that within the workplace. I mean, I also encourage students, for the educators out there, how to encourage students to be able to fight back or to disarm these aggressions. So before I get into my presentation today, I want to talk about the culture of today's society. Joanna brought up the conversation I'm sure many of us have been having in our public and private life about Breonna Taylor. And it's really nothing new, right? And so unfortunately, that's just the way it is. But in this space, we're going to try to make changes within this circle of influence. And even though we didn't win that battle, we're going to continue with the war. So I have 3 images that are here, and they're pretty much on the timeline. And so I want to kind of, to talk about that. So before I get into that, I want to quote a statement by Walter Johnson. It says, "One of the most durable paradoxes of white supremacy is the idea that those who are closest to an experience of oppression are its least credible witnesses." And what I love about that term is that you have people who are not speaking from a quantitative perspective, they're speaking from a qualitative perspective. They're speaking from an ethnography perspective, an autobiography perspective of these are the things that I actually experienced dealing with racism or other forms of oppression. And so, but when we talk about these things, we're considered to be least credible witnesses. And we see that with Mia and Eleanor's interaction, right? When Mia brings up race, Eleanor has a rebuttal and say, well, I would never bring up race in this situation. And unfortunately, that is the culture that we live in. And that's one of the products of white supremacy, right? It's to almost make you think you're crazy for the things that you're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And so what we have in the wood cutting is actually a free Black. As you see, he has his top hat on the ground. He's clothed to the nine, and he's actually being kidnapped, and he's going to be sold down south. So what this tells us is that policing or surveilling really comes to control our bodies, to take our bodies, right, and use them to their benefit. Even though this is a free Black man, he has papers, he is still being kidnapped and sold into slavery. And it kind of ties into the movie 12 Years a Slave. So this is circa 19th century when this woodcut was made. About 100 years later, there's a woman with a knee in her neck doing the civil rights movement. She was literally just walking by with a Sunday best on, and these 4 police officers assaulted her. And this officer has his knee on this lady's neck. She wasn't causing any harm. The only crime that she committed was she's a free Black woman. And that led to her demise. And then we have the infamous picture of George Floyd that happened in May 2020. And where the police officer had his knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So I want to kind of explain this idea of policing and where it comes from in America. Policing actually is rooted in slave patrols, or called paddy rollers. They were organized by groups of armed white men who monitored and enforced discipline upon Black slaves in antebellum U.S., southern United States. First formed in 1704 in South Carolina, slave patrols lasted into 1865, which was the end of the Civil War. The reason it ended because the paddy rollers, or the slave patrollers, were called to fight on the side of the Confederacy. when there were no more slave patrollers around, slaves literally walked off in the thousands, walked away from their slave plantations. So the purpose of a paddy roller or a slave patroller on their beat was to do three things: to chase down and apprehend runaway slaves. Number two, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts. And Nat Turner and John Brown actually put a lot of fear into slaveholders in the South. So they want to make sure to qualm those revolts. And number three, they want to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice. So they wanted to keep them working so much that they didn't think about freedom. That was the purpose. So today, those things haven't changed too much. That's what they do today. If you're in a neighborhood that they perceive you shouldn't be in, they want you out of that neighborhood. They want to terrorize you to be fearful, to not stand up for your rights as an individual. That's what their job is there to do. And also, they're also there to make sure that you don't get what's owed to you, and that's your human rights, not civil rights. So I kind of want to put that into the context, and that's why this slide is called Same Suit, Different Bowl, because it's the same thing it was in the 17th, 18th century, and then 19th century, and the 20th century, and then even the 21st century. So nothing has changed, unfortunately. All right, so this is the working language. And this is a few of the definitions, but I wanted to be top heavy because a lot of these terms we use interchangeably. And I want to make sure I clarify those for this particular space, right? Because we know racism and race mean different things in different countries, but here in America, it means this, right? And like I said, there's many ways to define these terms. So race is a social construct and a myth differing from nationality and ethnicity. Race is determined by a rubric created in whiteness to determine who has power and who does not. Because race is imaginative, it mutates over time. I give an example of that. When the Zulus were in Africa, they didn't call themselves Africans, they called themselves Zulus. Upon the colonizing arriving to Africa, they told the Zulus that you're actually Africans, and they treated them homogeneously with other nations. Once they left Africa, they became Negroes, then they became colored, then they become Black, and now today we're African American. So you see this idea of race, or what Omi and what not calls master categories, or these caste systems that we're placed in, right? So the concept of race is actually a myth, because we can categorize people by many different things, but we choose race. Racism. Racism is above anything about practices and behaviors that produce a racial structure or a caste system or stratification, a network of social relations at social, political, economic, and ideological levels that shape the life chances of various races. Implicit bias suggests that people can act on the basis of prejudice and stereotypes without intending to do so. We all have implicit biases. Like I said before, microaggressions are rooted in these implicit biases. Ethnicity, a social construct which divides people into smaller social groups based on characteristics such as shared sense of group membership, values, behavior patterns, language, political, economic interests, history, and ancestral geographical base. And structural racism. According to Lawrence and Keelier, structural racism in the US is the normalization, legitimization of an array of dynamics, historical, cultural, institutional, interpersonal, that routinely advantage whites by producing cumulative and chronic diverse outcomes of people of color. I think a simpler way of saying that is a great friend of mine named Daniel Meter. He puts it this way. In simpler terms, structural racism is racism on autopilot. That's a great way to put it. We're born into the structural racism. It's already laid out for us, and the systems of oppression and control through physical violence are already there. All right, so I was trying to come up with a way to kind of segue into microaggressions. I just didn't want to drop this term that many people probably never heard of, or those that are familiar with it. But I kind of want to try to find a way to segue into microaggressions and tie it into the workplace. Because some people may be in denial or maybe need quantifiable evidence. So as I was researching to do another presentation to talk about the underrepresentation of Black people in STEM and the idea of the curriculum, I found this data, and it just really blew my socks off. And I call this slide employee STEM data. I can't breathe at work. It says roughly 6 in 10 Black STEM workers, 62%, say they have experienced any of the 8 specific forms of racial and ethnic discrimination. Those 8 forms of discrimination are listed on your right-hand side of the screen. One of those forms of discrimination are called small slights at work, one of the 8. 62% of Black employees say they experience this in the STEM field, 44% Asians, 42% of Hispanics, and 13% of whites in STEM jobs. And so what are these small slights, right? And so they didn't call it microaggressions, but that's what they are. They're microaggressions. And so 62%, so we're talking roughly 2/3 of all Black employees, right, at work experience these within their jobs. As Joanna mentioned earlier, I worked as an engineer. One of the reasons I left engineering and became an educator was because of the racism that I experienced on my job. I was not given big projects. I was hired as a token. They hired me so they can get government contracts because you have to have a certain level, a certain quota of minoritized people within your company to get contracts. I seen people doing the same work that I did were getting paid more than me. And I was like, I'm tired of dealing with this. I'm a valuable employee. I work very hard, and why I'm not getting paid the same. So that's one of the reasons why I left and started teaching, because I felt a better calling to teach. And also within the engineering environment, I felt that oppression that I was dealing with. And so even though I didn't have the language of racial battle fatigue or microaggressions, I knew something wasn't right. So Chester Pierce is the gentleman who actually coined the term microaggression or racial microaggressions. And what he says there are is offensive mechanisms that small continuous bombardments of microaggressions is the essential ingredient in race relations and race interaction. So what he noticed is, in his career, he noticed that Black employees' interaction with the public and how they experience these race interactions on a day-to-day basis. Daryl Wing Sue is probably the most quoted or most cited person to continue this work. And he defines racial microaggressions as the everyday slights. If I go back to the previous slide, you see the small slights at work. He calls them everyday slights. Insults, put downs, invalidations, and offensive behaviors that people of color experience in daily interactions with generally well-intentioned white Americans. And I want to stop there and highlight generally well-intentioned white Americans or generally well-intentioned people. And so a lot of times we put a lot of focus on the intention versus the effect. Even though you had good intentions, there still was an effect that was on me for that situation, where I carried the gall and the negativity with me, even though you meant well.
Dr. Brownlee, we have a question regarding the study. If you'd like to go back 2 slides, please.
Yes, I sure would.
Okay, so the question is, Native Americans or First Nation people are not included in those numbers, and they're wondering if they're part of another category, or were they not included in the study?
The reality of it is, a lot of times in these studies, because there's so less of a population of Native Americans, sometimes they don't even include them in the data, and I have a problem with that. So I'm glad you brought that up. So a lot of times when we look at this data, and we even see it with we collect data within higher education, sometimes they don't even really include them, right? And that's a form of a macroaggression to be excluded. And so a lot of these studies we see they're not included, and I definitely have an issue with that. So I'm glad you brought that question up, because that's something that I'm definitely pushing for on our campus, is the representation of Native Americans in the curriculum within STEM. So I'm actually working on that right now with the outreach and marketing department at the Australia Mount Community College. So I thank you for sharing that. I appreciate you bringing that question up, because that's a reality that we're dealing with. As an advisor of the Men Empowerment Network, and me and Daniel Meter are the advisors of that at Australia Mount Community College. One of the things we constantly bring up is, how do we get Native Americans involved, right? Because a lot of times they are definitely overlooked as the first persons of this nation. So thank you for bringing that up.
That's the only question we have right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that question. Thank you. I appreciate that. I really do. And so there are different types of macroaggressions. Micro insults, micro assaults, and micro invalidations. A micro insult is unconscious verbal, nonverbal, environmental communications that subtly convey abrasive and insensitivity that demean a person's race or culture. So a white student asking a student of color, did they get accepted into the university because of affirmative action, right? That'd be like a micro insult. It's like, why can't I just be accepted because I have a 4.0 GPA? I did 2,000 hours of community service and I wrote a bomb personal statement. And so we just assume that, oh, you're Black, you got accepted into this Ivy League school, you must affirmative action. Micro assaults, conscious and intentional discriminatory actions on one's identity. So examples, hanging of a Confederate flag on your porch, and when you know what that image stands for, yelling reverse racism whenever diversity, equity, inclusion is brought up, policies that separate families at the border. These are micro assaults. They're conscious, they're done with intent. And then you have micro invalidation, communication that subtly exclude, negate, or nullify the thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a person's identity. So when you're sharing somebody about racism and they say, well, I don't see color. You know, I've heard that expressed by a lot of educators, and I'm not always aligned with that idea, because if you don't see color, then you don't see me. You're excluding me, right? And who I am as a person, because my color is part of my identity, because it's an intersectionality of many other things, my color, my gender, my ethnicity, my class, all these things make me who I am. It's what we call colorblind racism. And so these are a few racial macroaggressions, and I spend majority of my presentation on racial microaggressions, but there are other forms of microaggressions. But I kind of highlight that because of what we're discussing today. So some of them could be, what are you? You speak English so well. Where are you from? Where are you really from? No, where are you really from? You're not like other Muslim people. You don't act like a normal Black person. Why do you sound white? Your name is too hard to pronounce. Can I call you Mary? You're really pretty for someone dark. One of the microaggressions I used to get often was about my eye color. So my great-great-grandfather was a white man, pure-blooded white man. He was Scottish. So that made my grandmother 1/8 white. So my grandmother has these hazel grayish kind of looking eyes, straight hair, and she could almost pass for a white person. So I was born, to skip the generation, I was born with the same color eyes. So growing up, people assumed that my father was white. Some people are like, oh, is your father white? And I'm like, no, my dad's Black. Well, how did you get this color eyes? It was slavery. That's what happened. My great-great-grandfather was a white man. And so you have these people just almost being intrusive and invasive of your space. And it's like, you know, I don't appreciate you. Why does it matter what my eye color is? Why does it matter if my father is white? That's none of your business, right? So I want to show a video of what microaggressions are or is. And this video is going to explain it in a very simplistic way for us to understand.
What are microaggressions? Microaggressions is a pretty big group of things to talk about, but specifically the definition we're working with are actions and or statements that can be intentional or unintentional that ultimately show discrimination and bias. Microaggressions occur with most people because a lot of us have biases that we're not even aware of. And something else we're also not aware of is the amount of diversity that's around us. But diversity has a lot of different levels and layers to it. It may not only just be race or gender, it may be in all kinds of things, just, you know, the area where you grew up, or maybe religious factors, things like that. So, I mean, some very common ones that we hear oftentimes in our culture are things like, where are you from, or where are you really from, as a follow-up question. You know, we can't eat here, this place is too ghetto. Or even a very common one we hear often, you know, is, all these things are too gay, when we're saying we don't like something. So a lot of these things are considered to be common slang terms or colloquialisms a lot of us use to express our emotions, but we don't realize how offensive they actually are. But you're going to not only figure out how to address and change the bias within ourselves, but also to feel empowered to create change in your environment. You're not only creating change within yourself, but you're also changing the world around you, and I think that at large will be able to change the world as a whole.
right. So I wanna bring something to the surface that she didn't really talk about. One of the things about microaggressions is, yeah, there are these slights, insults that are actually there, but there is an undertone message within the microaggression itself. So the gentleman that brought up the question about the representation of Native Americans in this study, the person may say, well, I didn't intend it to be that way, but there's a message that's there, right? That's sent out as if maybe that ethnicity, race, demographic does not matter. That's the message that is there, right? And so that's what microaggressions do. So it's not just the inquiry of, can I touch your hair? There's a message that's there, that's underlining, that is subtle, right? That we get from that. And I would get into that more, but I definitely just want to understand that microaggression, there's like a two-part. It's what is said and what is not being said, or what is non-verbally not being said, but what's the message that has been interpreted that's there. So I have this video that I found online, which is very, very unique because it gives a different perspective of people's relations to microaggressions. So a lot of time when we talk about microaggressions, we talk about people being intrusive, right? Or they're doing things, you know, not knowing what they're doing because they're curious. But in this video, what you're going to see is two different responses to the same question, can I touch your hair, right? I remember when I did actually have hair, when I was in middle school, at the time, hot top fades was out. I don't know if y'all know about hot top fades. It's Kid and Play and Big Daddy Kane. And this was the time where everybody wanted to have a hot top fade. And I had a hot top fade. I was very proud. And I remember going to school and predominantly white students would say, well, can I touch your hair? And we'll be like, no, you can't touch my hair. And they would ask questions like, why do you put pink oil moisturizer in your hair? Why do you put grease in your hair? Like, I felt like I was being examined under a petri dish, right, for having this particular hairstyle. Obviously, I don't have hair right now, but those were the good old days when I did. But it was just, you know, so can I touch your hair? It's just not limited to women. It also includes men as well. So I'm gonna play this video right now.
When you're done with that, Dr. Brownlee, we do have a question. So.
Okay, you know, I can take the question right now.
Okay, so someone was asking, would the expectation to be happy and smile all the time be considered a microaggression?
I would personally, for me, no. I think to be happy and smiling is almost like a defense response, right, to the microaggression. Because a lot of times we know that when we're under pressure or in an emergency, it's three ways where we respond. We either freeze, or we fight, or we flight, right? It's one of those three things that we actually do. So to smile all the time would be maybe a way that you react to maybe that uncomfortable situation. But what happens though, even though you're smiling, inside there's something that's actually going on. And so later in this particular presentation, I'm going to talk about those things, like how do we respond to where we don't always have to pretend like we like it, you know what I mean? And so there's ways to be able to engage. So to be able to smile and you know, pretend like everything's okay, actually maybe hurt you physiologically and psychologically, perhaps. But yeah, I know for me, I'm tired of smiling, right? And so I made a decision to say, you know what, I'm going to educate people on how you're making me feel and what that actually means. Because a lot of times I think we default to the idea of the intention versus how I feel.
We can watch the video now, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Can I touch your hair?
Oh gosh. How many times have I heard that? No.
No.
I think it's really rude. No.
They'll be like, oh, is this your real hair? Disgusting.
Annoyed.
You're getting too close to me.
No. Can I touch your hair?
I'm not a pet. Some people don't even ask, they just reach and I'm like, whoa, hey, you know, you can't touch my hair.
Kind of irritating. It depends on who's asking.
I love it when people ask me that. It's not offensive.
Yes. Sure, my hair is fabulous. Most people say nah, but you can touch mine, hey. We're chameleons, we're always changing. It's always something new. It's like an accessory.
I have this happen to me all the time. It's usually white ladies. I'm gonna be upset about somebody asking they touch mine. Sure.
Can I touch your hair?
A lot of people ask me that. And yeah, I usually let them touch my hair.
Is that ever frustrating?
Yeah.
Can I touch your hair?
All right.
So I'm sorry, Dr. Brownlee, to interrupt one more time with a quick question.
Yeah.
So do you differentiate between a cancel culture and a productive conversation between two people where one might have experienced a microaggression?
That's a good question, and I think it ties into my summation of the video. And so you have two responses to the same stimuli. Can I touch your hair, right? And you have one person that says, no, you cannot touch my hair. And they may be defensive, which is their right to feel that way because that's their body. But then you have another side to where you're saying, yeah, you know, you can touch my hair, let me educate you on that. So I don't believe in I'm not a big fan of cancel culture because so sometimes I think it's a herd mentality. I am a big fan of educating people. And, you know, so I don't always feel the same way on every single subject. And I try to stay away from jumping on bandwagons of cancel culture between different things. Because I really do believe sometimes people make mistakes. They didn't really mean what they said or they didn't intend something terrible to happen, right? Because to be honest, we all need grace and mercy at some point in our lives. But I am always questioning this systemic behavior, right? This repetitive behavior. We see this thing over and over and over again, then that's another question. But sometimes people just make mistakes. And being that we're in this social political atmosphere, people have to be very careful where they're stepping, because you can say one word, it can definitely end your career, even though that's not what you meant. But see, this is why it's so important to be educated and to empathize and sympathize with people who are not like you. I have said the wrong thing at the wrong time before, and I have received grace and mercy from people to say, okay, you made a mistake, let me educate you on that, right? And so we're all progressive in trying to figure this thing out.
And Dr. Brownlee, just really quickly, and then we'll move on to the polling that you have, the polling questions. Can you just explain what cancel culture is? We have a couple of questions about that.
Well, cancel culture, a lot of times it's when, I use an example. Recently, there was a TV personality or radio personality, I think in North Carolina, off the air, he used the N-word. And automatically people asked him to be fired, and he was fired because of that. One time a news anchor was trying to say the Los Angeles Lakers, but made a mistake and confused some terms, and it sounded like she said the N-word, or he said the N-word, and they end up losing their job. So cancel culture is in reference to people's careers, or maybe even a product that maybe made a mistake. But I think that's why it's so important to have diversity training and understanding other people so you can be better aware of to not use certain terms. There was an issue with the head coach for Oklahoma State University. He wore a pro-Trump t-shirt, and his football players got very, very upset behind that. And some of them called for him to resign. I don't know if he resigned or was he fired, but they were highly upset. And he's like, well, I wasn't aware. And the question should be is, Oklahoma State University football team is predominantly Black players. You don't know where they stand socially, politically on certain topics. And what it was speaking to is his apathy, right? His indifference and his inability to relate to his players. So that's what cancel culture is, I think, in my opinion. I'm sure there's many different definitions out there.
And Dr. Brownlee, for me, the can I touch your hair conversation, we talked about this when we were talking earlier, in that for me, that one is very offensive because the question comes as the person's hand is already in my head, which for me is then a little too late. So you're not, you know what I mean? You're not asking, you're assuming, right, that it is your right. And then that takes rights away from me, which is I would never, and I also equated to the same thing when I was pregnant with both of my children. I found it highly offensive for a complete stranger to walk up to me and touch me on the stomach. And I was like, in what world was that an acceptable thing to walk up to a complete stranger who is female, right? And it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman, and put your hand on their body. Like that to me, like did not compute. So while yes, that can be productive conversations, if we start a conversation and you're very interested in how I do my hair, how it's cut, how I get it curly, what products I use, oh, the texture looks interesting, and all of those things, I'm open to it. But for it to be somehow you feel like it's your right, because you're interested and because you're fascinated to then reach out and touch it, I find that to be, for me, Joanna, I find that to be highly offensive, you know, and I don't care who's doing it. So that's
yeah, absolutely. And the name of the video is Can I Touch? So there's some level of respect in asking, right? Versus being intrusive. And so just to kind of give some people some context of maybe say, well, why is that such a big issue? What makes it a big issue is slavery, right? Is that at one time we didn't own our bodies. Right, so we would be on the slave auction block, and they would open our mouths and pull our tongues out and grab our hair, and they would do all these things, and we had to run up and down stairs and to perform because we're property, right? Or they perceived us to be property, chattel slavery. And so fast forward to today, this is my body. It belongs to me. You don't have a right to touch my body. Now, if you ask, now that gives me the option, right, to say, no, you can't, or yeah, I can teach you about some things, but to just walk up, you know, and touch it, that's an issue. So there's something that needs to be addressed because there's some context behind that, right? It's like because of slavery, right? We didn't own our bodies, now we do, and that's an issue. All right, we ready for the polling piece, Brent? Thanks for sharing, Joanne, I appreciate that.
We are ready, and we're going to be collecting questions for later so that we can respect you and all the great work you've done to put this presentation together, and we'll ask those questions at the end so that you can get through, okay? I don't want to interrupt you anymore. All right, are you ready for the first poll?
Yes, I am.
All right, launching poll. We are getting lots of answers. Have you witnessed a racial microaggression? And that's still going up. We'll give about another 10 seconds, so get your answers in. Yes, no, not sure. All right. All right, we're gonna end the poll and we will share the results with 90% saying yes. So Dr. Brownlee.
Wow, that's great. That's great. Okay. So this is a familiar topic, which is wonderful. So that is great data to know as we approach the end when we talk about these micro interventions. Okay, thank you. 90%. Okay. All right. Ready for the second question?
All right. Second one is about experiencing a racial microaggression. All right, we'll end the poll and share here. It's a little different.
Okay, so 90% have witnessed one. Write that down. And 64% say they have experienced one. 27% said no. 9% said not sure. Okay. All right. What's interesting is that 64% kind of mirrors the data that I had earlier, right? With the Black STEM employees at 62%. So that's interesting to see that the data is very similar. Okay. Brent, is it possible to open up the floor with somebody who wants to share one?
I think based on timing and everything right now, I think we should continue on Dr. Brownlee.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, so we're gonna switch from microaggressions to macroaggressions, all right? So the major difference is two. Microaggressions are usually subtle, right? They're not intentional. They're usually based off curiosity. Racial microaggressions are a little bit different. Racial microaggressions are like premeditated. So the difference between structural racism and macroaggressions, let me back up some. And structural racism, so I have this diagram. Structural racism is the normalization of racism. And we've seen this with Breonna Taylor's case yesterday. It's the normalization of racism. We see the normalization of racism within the police department. And, you know, so we have judicial systems that are normalized that way. Our education system is normalized that way, and healthcare as well. So that is outside of our circle of influence. We really can't control that because it's these cogs that are working. Racial microaggressions are like these premeditated, blatantly damaging acts that make an impact to people on the individual level. So they come in the forms of assaults, policies, the crossing of boundaries and spaces, and gatekeeping. And so I like to highlight this term gatekeeping because it's usually people who are US citizens are saying, well, you're not from this country, leave, get out of here. You don't deserve to be here. I'm calling the police on you. There's a colleague of mine that was sharing with me that within a particular higher education space, which I'm not going to say, is that when advisement of the school found out that students were not citizens of the United States of America, even though they were college students, they were called ICE on them. That's a form of a racial macroaggression. And so macroaggressions from a societal viewpoint can be classified as macro assaults. So an example of that would be Jim Crow laws and Chinese exclusionary acts. Macro insults, government policies aimed at civilizing American Indians. We see that even here in Phoenix, Arizona, we have a street called Indian School, right? And the history behind that was Native Americans, indigenous people were taken off of their reservations, and as they say, we wanted to kill the Indian but save the man. They were given biblical names, cut their hair, and dressed as Europeans. And we'll say macro invalidations are forced assimilation and acculturation, like requiring Black women to straighten their hair because it looks too urban, right? So you can't wear braids or a blowout or something of that nature because it looks too urban. So that's the difference. Structural racism, we typically can't control, and we try to impact it because we want to change the policies, right? But racial microaggressions and macroaggressions are like interchangeable on a day-to-day basis. So to kind of show the difference between the two is I'm gonna use Daniel Kahneman's system of thinking. He said there's two ways of thinking. That's instinctive, and then there's slower, or what they call system one thinking and system two thinking. System one thinking is quick, emotional, unconscious, little, no effort, automatic, right? And so our microaggressions come out of there. They come out of those implicit biases, right? So if I think a particular race is pathologically bad, whenever I interact with them, I'm going to act a certain way. But when I look at system two thinking, it's slower, rational, conscious, right? It's more logical. That's where macroaggressions come out. It's almost like premeditated assault, right? And so you're thinking about these, these ideologies. So for instance, the narrative that's been pushed by President number 45 is that coronavirus came from China, right? And so because of that, it has been reported that there has been an increase of Asian people being attacked verbally and physically because of this narrative. And it's coming out of that system two thinking. So here are some examples of macroaggressions, macro assaults, like I mentioned earlier. The coronavirus exposes the history of racism and cleanliness. That was the article that was written. The message there is the news of the coronavirus is amplifying a specific form of bigotry called xenophobia, hostility against China, its people of Chinese descent and Chinese culture. That's what it's saying. Macro insults, McGraw-Hill education geography textbooks that refers to Africans brought to American plantation as workers rather than slaves. What's the message that's there? Southern states attempting to control the narrative that Black people were happy in slavery and that Civil War was not about slavery, but rather taxes and economics. That's the message that's there. Macro invalidations. Black women with natural hairstyles are less likely to get job interviews. What's the message that's really there? If a Black woman is going to be part of a corporate culture, they will be expected to not only dress the part, but dress their hair the part as well. In other words, natural and nappy is not accepted. These are variations of macroaggressions. So I have a video here that I'm going to show that kind of paints macroaggressions and shows the difference between macro and micro.
Mike and Cher, this woman has been spotted all over Torrance, cussing at people and even making racial slurs. And in one video, she says, "I'm not a racist." Well, I'll let you be the judge of that.
Oh, okay, you're making a racist comment right now?
Do you know how many people can't stand you being here?
Oh, great.
You play games. We don't play games.
Oh, what kind of game are you playing?
I play games where you get to death.
The racist ranting woman was captured here by a Torrance man and his 11-year-old son while trying to enjoy their morning at the park.
You understand me, China man?
Respect.
Respect.
Respect people.
Respect.
Lady.
I understand your language,
Respect.
He says what's worse, it was in front of his son.
It's completely another thing to say racial slurs to minors. They need to be protected.
Then this, online, the Torrance man who does not want to be identified saw that very woman screaming once again.
She made a previous attack on another Asian minor. That was a tipping point for me.
And then this.
That's a voice you don't forget. That's a face you don't forget, especially what she had done to me.
On the local news, Casey Lynn Salmanoa heard that very voice of a woman who she says threw her to the ground in a public restroom last October.
Crazy lady points down at me and says, "You better not get the F up or else." And then I get up, of course, and then that's when she physically grabs my hair and pushes me down and starts punching the back of my head.
She was standing up for the cleaning woman who was being allegedly verbally attacked by the woman. Police reports were made, but it's unclear if any action was taken.
In 2020, nobody should be hearing these kind of racial slurs.
My dad was innocent and he did nothing wrong, so I was confused.
And for the first time, the Torrance man had to explain to his 11-year-old what's racism.
Don't be discouraged by this one sad incident, but at the same time, this is a reality of where things are, so we need to make things right and continue to fight.
Hoping that no one else has to endure the wrath of this ranting woman.
Do you know who my family is? Do you know who your family is? Go home to your family. This is from your government.
Respect.
Go home.
Lady.
So what makes this a macroaggression is, one, there was a physical assault in the bathroom. She was playing gatekeeper or vanguard by yelling these statements at people she considered to be foreign or alien. Go home. It's intentional, and she's encouraging assimilation, right, as far as language is concerned. So that's what makes this a macroaggression. All right, and so what happens over time? So far we talked about microaggressions, macroaggressions, and so let's kind of transition and think about the workplace. You know, your classroom, your employees that you work with. If they experience these types of microaggressions, right? It's not just limited to racial. It can be other ways that they experience them. It leads to what they call mundane extreme environmental stress, right? And so in this definition that has the word racial, but you can replace that with another term. So mundane extreme environmental stress is a social psychological theory that explains how racial oppression affects the daily lives of families of color by showing how the psychological burden of dealing with racism, when it is daily, constant, and random, making one always on guard, much like war. The theory asserts that these stressors create traumatic shock that has physical and emotional consequences. So if you look at the diagram to the left, it has racial microaggressions, and it shows, you know, so those three separate circles are actually one human being, right? Think of it as one person, but they affect that person in many different areas: behavior stress, psychological stress, and physiological stress. So the M in mundane extreme environmental stress is defined as mundane B because this is a stress part of our day-to-day experience and so common that we almost take it for granted. It's what Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, calls racial realism. It's this idea that race is permeating all the time or omnipresent, right? It's just a part of your day, right? Unfortunately, that's the way it is. So you're applying for this job within your company, and you know that you qualify for this job, but you know in the back of your head, you know what? They're not really going to hire me. Why? Because this is the part of my day-to-day experience. Extreme, because it has an extreme impact on our psyche and worldview, how we see ourselves, behave, and interact with each other, right? And then environmental, because it is environmentally located, induced, and fostered. So environmental, think about the place that you work at, right? Do they foster diversity? Do they promote diversity? Or is it a toxic working environment where they're pushing this idea of uniformity, where diversity is not accepted? Think about your classrooms where, think about your curriculum that you're offering to your students. Is it very Eurocentric, where there's not a place for students to interject themselves? And the S stands for stress, because the ultimate impact is indeed stressful, detracting, and energy consuming. That stress part is what we're going to talk about later, this idea of leading to fatigue. So mundane, extreme, environmental stress. So that's what MEES stands for. So a professor by the name of William A. Smith came up with this racial microaggression like stress diagram. And once again, when you look at these three different categories, think about one person, right? Think about this as one individual. And so according to Chester Pierce, racism is a mental health and public health disease characterized by perceptual distortion, contagion, and fatality. The vehicle for these characteristics is cumulative effect of offensive mechanism. What I love that he talks about is that racism is mental health and public health disease. It's a disease. Martin Luther King, using a spiritual lens, a theological lens, said racism is evil, right? And so these are things we have to keep in mind. It's just not these individual acts, right? It's something that it's something we have to address it like it's a sickness, or take a spiritual lens as MLK and when he calls it a evil. So you have psychological stress responses. I'm not going to read them all, but I'll pick a few: frustration, apathy, anger, disappointment, disbelief, fear, right? The physiological stress responses: headaches, grinding of teeth, high blood pressure, muscle aches, intestinal problems, hive, rashes, sleep disturbance. Emotional behavior stress responses: stereotype, the John Henryism, or prolonged, in the sense of, as a person of color, I have to work twice as hard, right? This John Henryism, to get the same results that someone that is non-Black or European would get. High efforts of coping with difficult psychological stressors, overeating, quickness to argue, procrastination, increase of use of drugs, right? All these things are there. Poor school and job performance, right? Where these racial microaggressions happen, right? So we're not talking about one instance. We're talking about on a day-to-day basis of dealing with verbal and nonverbal, right? Covert and overt, every day, every day, every day, every day, every day, every day. So these things are compounding, right? To the point where you end up at racial battle fatigue. So it's microaggressions, macroaggressions, mundane extreme environmental stress, MEES, and then racial battle fatigue. So William A. Smith, a professor at University of Utah, coined this term in his book chapter called Black Faculty Coping with Racial Battle Fatigue. He defines it as a response to the distressing mental emotional conditions that results from facing racism every day, every single day. Smith and Sue offer a list of verbal and nonverbal slights that exist in racial battle fatigue, such as unfair treatment, hostile environments coupled with hostile communications. Recently, we had a diversity, equity, inclusion meeting. I'm part of that particular task force on our campus, and I'm privileged to be in that position. But one of the things that kept coming up was this denial of promotion. So we had these people of color who were adjunct faculty for years complaining, why is it I can't get a faculty or residential position? I'm good enough to teach adjunct faculty class, but I'm not good enough for a residential position, because what happened was that they constantly keep hiring white faculty members consistently, right? And so people are upset, so they see the unfair treatment. And so over time, you just become hopeless and say, well, you know, what should I do? Should I quit? Should I go to another campus? You know, because these things are frustrating when you know that I qualify for the job. Now, we're not talking about you applying for a job and they interview you and said no. No, you're applying for a job and you're not even getting an interview, being that you taught those courses for the last 5, 6, 7 years. Racial battle fatigue is a conceptual framework that examines the psychological and physiological and behavioral impact on people of color brought upon them by white domination. Racial battle fatigue speaks directly to the psychological symptoms resulting from occupying and navigating through racist environments. And so, like I said before, some of these stresses are headaches, high blood pressure, poor school performance, and impatience. The first time I heard this term was roughly about 4 years ago. I was speaking to a mentor of mine by the name of David Stovall, and I was telling him how I was feeling, and he mentioned this term, and I looked it up, and I was like, that's exactly how I feel. That's exactly how I feel. And I gravitated to this term. I was like, that's exactly how I feel, because I didn't have a language for it to explain it. So I'm going to show 2 videos. One is by James Baldwin. If you're not familiar with who James Baldwin is, he's a very great author. One of the best. He's not. It was sad he's not included in a lot of English courses or writing courses. But James Baldwin is going to talk about his relationship with institutions and how that made him feel and why he left America to go study and write in other spaces.
Some of it.
Did you hear anything that you disagreed with?
I disagreed with a great deal of it. And of course, there's a good deal I agree with. But I think he's overlooking one very important matter, I think. Each one of us, I think, is terribly alone. He lives his own individual life. He has all kinds of obstacles in the way of religion or color or size or shape or lack of ability. And the problem is to become a man.
But what I was discussing was not that problem, really. I was discussing the difficulties, the obstacles, the very real danger of death thrown up by the society when a Negro, when a black man attempts to become a man.
All this emphasis upon black man and white does emphasize something which is here, but it emphasizes it or perhaps exaggerates it, and therefore makes us put people together in groups which they ought not to be in. I have more in common with a black scholar than I have with a white man who's against scholarship. And you have more in common with a white author than you have with someone who's against all literature. So why must we always concentrate on color or religion or this? There are other ways of connecting men.
I'll tell you this. When I left this country in 1948, I left this country for one reason only, one reason. I didn't care where I went. I might have gone to Hong Kong, I might have gone to Timbuktu. I ended up in Paris, on the streets of Paris, with $40 in my pocket on the theory that nothing worse could happen to me there than it already happened to me here. You talk about making it as a writer by yourself. You had to be able then to turn off all the antenna with which you live, because once you turn your back on this society, you may die. You may die. And it's very hard to sit at a typewriter and concentrate on that if you're afraid of the world around you. The years I lived in Paris did one thing for me. They released me from that particular social terror, which was not the paranoia of my own mind, but a real social danger visible. I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know, as Malcolm X once put it, it's the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby has anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
So what James Baldwin is saying there is that he's talking about his experience with America. And he said for him to be able to write the way he wants to write, he has to separate himself from this terror, right? This terror that's there of these racial violence against his life, these macroaggressions against his life. And I like what he said is when I showed up on the streets of Paris with $40 in my pocket, he said to himself, there's nothing worse that can happen to me here that didn't happen to me in America. Just think about that. He left the place of his home to go to another country with $40 in his pocket, right? With $40 in his pocket, because that's how bad that he felt in this country, or not bad, but the terror he experienced in this country. And so that's an example of racial battle fatigue, these things that you deal with all the time. And I like what he says, I'm dealing with this terror. It's not a figment of my imagination. I can look at the institutions, I can look at the church, I can look at the labor unions, I can look at the curriculum, and I can see that you do not like me. You do not care about me. And so what I wanted to do was bring another video up to speed to kind of show where we are today. That was in the 60s, but I have another video that I want to show, and it's called Again, This Again. Well, that's not what the video is called, but that's what he says in the video, and I think it's pertinent to what we're discussing today.
The video has gotten millions of views since the person who lives here posted it on social media. He was using chalk to write Black Lives Matter when a couple walking by said that he was doing something illegal.
What's your name again?
I'm Lisa.
Lisa, what's your last name?
What is your name?
His name is James Jaime Juanillo. He's lived at this home for 18 years running a dog walking business. On Tuesday afternoon, he started stenciling with chalk.
My first instinct is, again? This? Again?
Well, we're not doing anything illegal.
Neither am I.
Actually, you are actually.
Really? Oh, okay, well then, call the cops.
Thank you. We will do.
Lisa and Robert.
Yeah.
I'll be right here. And she decided to call men with guns because of my chalk art.
Juanillo says he knows many of the police officers in the neighborhood and that they didn't even get out of their car shortly after this video was taken.
I'm a person of color in Pacific Heights. This is San Francisco's maybe richest, whitest hood.
Multiple people have identified the woman in the video as Lisa Alexander, who's the CEO of a skincare line called LaFace. We reached out to her multiple times but got no response.
And that, people, is why Black Lives Matter.
Juanillo says he's a proud gay Filipino who knows what discrimination feels like.
So this isn't the first time I've experienced fear, maybe even a little bit of loathing that just kind of creeps out.
Birchbox, a makeup distribution service, posted this on its Instagram account, saying it has officially cut ties with LaFace and condemns the actions of Lisa Alexander.
And you don't know if I live here or if this is my property.
We actually do know.
I asked Juanillo if he's open to meeting her again.
If you want to come to my house and talk to me like an equal, then I will hear what you have to say and I will consider an apology.
He had 33 Twitter followers on Monday.
All right. So he says, again, this again. And he says this is not the first time that he experienced fear and loathing living in that neighborhood. That was his private property. He's been living there 18 years, has a great business, and he says, again, this again. So he's dealing with microaggressions in the sense of dealing with his race and maybe even his sexual orientation. So there's intersectionality that's there, right? So even in this privileged community, he says one of the best white hoods in San Francisco, he still has to deal with the racism.
The video.
All right, so this is the last polling question.
All right, we'll get the last poll up, which is about battle fatigue, racial battle fatigue. Have you ever heard about racial battle fatigue? We'll give it just a few more seconds. And here you go, Dr. Brownlee. We're going to end the poll, and here are your results.
All right, thank you. So, wow, 34%. I'll write this down real quick. That's 62%. Okay. Wow, that's great. So about 1/3 has, about 2/3 or so have not, and 4% not sure. Okay. Thanks everybody for completing the poll. I appreciate it. All right, so far we covered micro and macroaggressions. We covered MEES. We talked about mundane extreme environmental stress that bleeds into this idea of racial battle fatigue, and this idea of dealing with race, fighting it every single day. And it's just it's almost to the point to where like you have these stock responses because you know you're going into these hostile environments, you know, that your workplace or the gym per se, or other places like that. So I'm going to be talking now about this idea of micro interventions, but I'm kind of going to take the long way around before we get into micro interventions. Okay. So I have about 20 minutes or so. So I'm gonna kind of speed through this part, but not too fast. So question, where do you stand? Fighting back against racial battle fatigue, disarming microaggressions through micro interventions, according to Sue, right? And so Dr. Sue says you fall into 3 categories when you're dealing with racial battle fatigue, when you're dealing with microaggressions, right? You fall into these 3 categories. I actually said there are 4, but he says you're a target. Targets are people of color who are objects of racial prejudice and discrimination. Allies, I don't really like that term allies, because you can be an ally with me, but you cannot be an ally to another Black person. I like the term abolitionist, because abolitionist speaks to the structure, right? That we try to, you know, defund, depoliticize, we're trying to change the structure. So allies are individuals who belong to a dominant social group and through their support of non-dominant groups actively work toward the eradication of prejudicial practices. Bystander was a person I call passive indifference. Bystanders can be anyone who become aware and or witness unjust behavior or practices that are worthy of coming to action. And then you have the microaggressor or the macroaggressor, right? The person who's spewing this indifference. Now, the reason I created this chart this way is because I want to show a couple things. Number one is that at one time in all of our lives, we have been in these categories at one time in reference to microaggressions. So I use myself as an example. I was a microaggressor once as an educator. I was teaching high school at a high school here in West Phoenix, and it was a Hispanic Serving Institute. And so predominantly in my student population was 97, 98% Hispanics. But while I was referencing and talking to them, I kept using the word Mexican all the time. And one student raised his hand. He was like, Mr. Brownlee, I'm Guatemala. And I had to own that, right? I was like, wow, I can't believe I just did that. I was very disrespectful. Please forgive me for doing that, right? Could you educate me more about your culture? Then I asked the question, is anybody in here who identified as Hispanic, what country are you actually from or where your parents are from? And we began to talk about that. And I began to educate myself, or they rather began to educate me, the difference, right? And so at that point, I was a microaggressor, even though I was a target in other areas, right? And just having to grow and say, wow, these are things I have to address. It's been times where I was a bystander, right? And what we're seeing is that to do this work, there's a level of progression that we're learning through interaction, new vocabulary words, attending sessions like this with the DLA, taking courses, that it's a process that sometimes we fall into different categories, right? And that's why, and somebody mentioned the idea of cancel culture. That's why cancel culture, you have to be careful, because sometimes you may fall in one area and in another area, but it's not because you did it intentionally, you just didn't know, right? So I learned from that. I really did, and it helped me grow as an educator because I was from Atlanta. And so we didn't have a large, diverse population of Hispanics. So that was to my fault because I learned about the Hispanic culture from television. And so that tied into my implicit bias. So I had to deal with that. So I was trying to find a way to show all 4 of those characters on a stage, right? The target, bystander, ally, and microaggressor. And the other day I was in the kitchen and I think I was fixing some coffee and I was listening to this inspirational preacher. and he talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I realized in that parable, each 4 of those persons are in that parable, right? So if you're not familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's this gentleman who's riding this beast through Jericho. He's going down the, I think, Jericho Road, and he's attacked by robbers. And the robbers attack him and they beat him. And they leave him out on the ground. And they take his things and they leave. And as he laying there, 2 bystanders come by, a priest and a Levite. And so you would think that if they are a priest and a Levite, be in that relationship with God, that they would help. But in the parable, they don't. But the Samaritan, who are considered in that culture to be equated with dogs, the person that you wouldn't think helped, actually helped. So the Good Samaritan picks up the traveler that was robbed, the target, bandages up his wounds, takes him to the inn, gets him a room, and pays his bill, right? So what we see in this parable is the target is the traveler that was robbed. The bystander or the passive indifference was the priest and the Levite. The ally or abolitionist is the Good Samaritan. And the microaggressor or macroaggressor were the robbers. So what you see in the background is the priest and the Levite. They're riding their beast up towards, I think towards Jerusalem, right? So I was able to find a platform to kind of explain that. And what's interesting is all of us have been this at one time, right? In our lives. We haven't arrived, nor have we all arrived to a point where we've got everything right. This work is progressive. So what I want to focus on as we now I'm transitioning to talk about micro interventions, that we have to understand that there's a relationship between the target and the ally, right? That as a target, I have a duty to fight back, and as an ally, you have a duty to fight back with me, right? And so to do this work, we have to work together to fight back. So I think of a very a relationship that is that I really adore was Abraham Herschel and Martin Luther King. Abraham Herschel was Jewish, and I believe he was a rabbi. So that means he doesn't believe that God had a son by the name of Jesus. Well, on the flip side, Martin Luther King does believe that God had a son named Jesus, but they worked together. They marched together. There are many pictures of Abraham Herschel and Martin Luther King working together. So in that relationship, Martin Luther King was the target, but Abraham Herschel was the ally or the abolitionist. So it's this idea of working together. And so how do we work together? How do we implement this thing of self-care or caring for each other? So I did some research. I went to the American Psychological Association to kind of look up this idea of micro-interventions. It's like, well, what do they say about micro-interventions in the sense of racial stress and self-care? So I go to this website and I'm like, well, I'm trying to find a way to kind of implement this. So I go to this website and I'm looking at the different ways of self-care, racial stress and self-care. So I'm looking at the different types of ways and I'm like, okay, you can build and access a support network. That's wonderful. I'm very fortunate to have that at Australia Mountain with some great colleagues. I don't want to mention names because I may leave somebody out, but I have great colleagues I do that with. Incorporate traditions at home. I do that with my children. We pray, we study, we read, right, with my children. Get some exercise. I exercise about 4 or 5 times a week, trying to stay healthy. Deep breathing, right? My Apple Watch is always telling me to breathe. I journal. I journal every morning, at least every other morning. Limit my media intake. Counseling, therapy. As employees of the Maricopa Community College District, we're able to have 8 to 10 sessions with a therapist. Spirituality, and that can mean many different things, and podcasts. But one thing I didn't see was this idea of resisting. Almost it was telling me to just let the workplace be the way it is and just I deal with these things on my own. But what I realized, resisting is a form of self-care. So how can I resist these microaggressions, right? How can I do that? By disarming. And this one, Sue implements the idea of micro-intervention strategies, right? So a form of resistance is a form of self-care, right? So micro-interventions in many respects, right, have 2 primary functions. First, they serve to enhance the psychological well-being and provide targets, allies, and bystanders with a sense of control and self-efficacy, right? So if I'm going to work and this person are making these homophobic jokes, these xenophobic jokes, you know, I shouldn't have to smile and just take it. I should be able to equip myself to deal with that because it's really impacting me and they get to remain the same. So I'm taking all this stress home to my family. How was your work job today? Well, you know, Joe said what he said again about this demographic of people, and I really have a hard time with that. So I can journal that all I want, but at some point I'm gonna wanna push back. So resisting in the African-American tradition starts all the way back to slavery. When slaves were captured, they resisted. They ran, they fought against their oppressor. When they were shackled and put on these excursion boats to go to the slave ships, some of them resisted. They jumped off the boat into the ocean, right? And some of them actually committed suicide. When they got on the ship, there's reported of stories of mutiny. We see that with the movie Amistad. Resistance is a form of self-care. Even when they got on the auction block and they were sold to slave plantations, some of them ran, some of them escaped, some of them played sick, some of them played dumb, right? Some of them didn't work as hard. That was a form of resistance. So fast forward to today, on the job, we have to have a form of resistance of dealing with these microaggressions. So Dr. Sue gives 4 examples. Make the invisible visible. Disarm the microaggression or microaggression. Educate the offender or seek external. So what I'm going to do is kind of show this diagram of, it's a guy by the name Stephen Covey that I really like. He talks about being proactive and versus reactive. And so when the stimulus hits me, right, of a micro or macroaggression, I have a choice to respond. I can freeze, I can flight, or I can fight, or I can respond, right, in another way. And that's what micro interventions do, right? How we can push back, right? So it's being proactive versus being reactive, right? And so I'm going to use these case studies. I have 8 case studies that I'm going to go through to give examples of how we can respond in the workplace or in the classroom when it comes to microaggressions, right? And how we can actually push back, okay? So the first one is make the invisible visible. So case number 1, failing to learn to pronounce or continuing to mispronounce the names of people after they have corrected you. Instead, you issue them a nickname. What is the message being sent to the target? I do not see you or do not value you and your culture. Target's response, excuse me, that is not my name. My mother and father did not name me that. If you could learn to say German, Russian, and biblical names, you can learn to say mine, right? That's making the invisible visible. And that actually happened to me one time. I was in a graduate class at the University of Arizona. Sorry, Joanna, at the University of Arizona. And there were two black students in this class. It was myself and another gentleman. We'll say his name is Chuck. And she kept calling him Lewis and kept calling me Chuck. And we do not look alike. Chuck wears a hat every day to class. Chuck is dark skinned. Chuck talks with an accent. He's from Trinidad and Tobago. We don't even dress the same, right? But she kept calling me Chuck. So I sent the teacher an email and say, I don't appreciate you calling me his name and vice versa. And he doesn't like it as well. Her response to me was very unique. She says, well, I'm sorry I keep doing that, but I'm not racist. I have a grandchild that's biracial. That was her response to me. This is a faculty member who has a doctorate. And so that's case number 1. Case number 2, scheduling tests and projects on religious and cultural holidays. Message sent to the target. You must conform and compromise who you are. The target's response to that should be, there are many ways to measure the calendar year. The Gregorian calendar is just one way. In my religion, the Sabbath is a holy day and the first day of the week, right? So you're making the invisible visible. The next one is disarm the microaggression or macroaggression. So number 3, setting low expectations for employees and students from races, genders, and classes. Message sent to the target. I do not believe people from your gender, race, and class poses into the intelligence to do the job. You are a token or affirmative action project. Target's response. I have noticed that you favor that group of people versus me. I do not agree with that. I might be a Black woman, but that does not mean I cannot do the work. I am proud of my race and gender, right? So she's pushing her back against this implicit bias that most microaggressions are rooted in. Number 4, calling on and offering special projects, engaging and validating one gender, class, or race of person while ignoring others. Message sent to the target. I do not believe people from your gender, race, and class possess the intelligence to do the job. You're a token, an affirmative action product. Targets respond. Why did you hire me if you're not going to engage me in projects? Maybe I should look for another job with a company that values me, right? So you're pushing back. You're not taking it and just smiling and accepting it for what it is. You're pushing back. You're making it known. You're fighting against the microaggression. The third one is to educate the offender. Case number 5. Ignoring social political events that impact your students or employees. Message sent to the target. What impacts you outside of this space does not matter. You must bifurcate your community and social political concerns from your vocation education. Targets respond. I know you did not mention this, but Black Lives Matter has called for the defunding of the police on the news. Be that this is a criminal justice class, what are your viewpoints on that? Case number 6. Using inappropriate humor in the workplace of the class that degrade people from different groups. Message sent to the target. I do not care how you feel, even though Human Resources has provided training on this matter. You need to get over it. These are just words. Do not be sensitive. The target's response to that would be, one of the response would be, actually, according to Michelle Alexander, who wrote the book, The New Jim Crow, states that whites and blacks use drugs at the same rate. How would you feel if someone assumed something about you because of your race or your group? And the last one is to seek the external. Case number 7, expressing racially charged political opinions at work in the classroom as if the target of the opinions do not exist in class, meaning or workplace. Meaning, message sent to the target, you are insensitive to who I am. You only care about those who look and think like you, think alike, you indifferent to others. Target's response, report the incident to Human Resources. Use a hashtag on social media to make your experience go viral. Case number 8, using the term Mexican to refer to all Latinx people, even after you're informed of them, your home country, or that you are a U.S. citizen. Message sent to target, you're an alien in your own country, or that all Latinx people are the same. Target's response, report the incident to Human Resources, turn to your community leaders or members for support, right? So different ways that you can respond, right? And so I included case number 8 because it referred to me. But what I added though, even after you're informed of their home country, after I did that microaggression and they informed me what happened, I never did it again. But if you repeatedly keep doing it, right, that's what leads to racial battle fatigue, and that's how you push back. So I'm pretty much at the end of my presentation. We'll open it up for question and answers. But the summary of the presentation today was we covered micro and macroaggressions. We covered mundane extreme environmental stress. We covered racial battle fatigue, and I just finished up covering micro interventions. And so if I can summarize what I'm talking about today is this. As allies, abolitionists, we have a duty and responsibility to resist oppression in the form of micro and macroaggressions to help ensure that our psychological, physiological, and emotional states are healthy. Resisting is a form of self-care. And I am at the end of my presentation.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Dr. Brownlee, that is amazing. I know you covered like a whole semester's worth. I mean, literally, that's like a whole class in itself. And I just want you to know how grateful we are for the information, how grateful we are for just the education. I think for many of us, this is lifelong in terms of the learning and the work. And I just think there's no end to this process, you know. So I'm just very grateful. Like I said, when you and I were talking, you know, the whole idea of racial battle fatigue is something, I think Tiki Carmichael says it in the chat. I knew I was feeling it. I knew I was experiencing it. I just didn't know there was like this term, right, that it was called. So I'm with Tiki. Now I know the term. I can use it correctly. So what I would love to do, Brent, do we have some questions? I would love to just be able to take some questions. And again, I want to just frame the context of the questions. And I know we put the rules of engagement in the chat box. I want to ask questions specific to Dr. Brownlee's experience and expertise and presentation. If you want to ask questions that clarify it. I want you guys to ensure that you're not being so myopic in your question that is only relevant to you, that for the 200 people that we have on this call, they're able to benefit from your question and thus answer. So I want you to be mindful of the community environment that we are in. So I'm going to have, and if you do have a question, if you would let us know, and then I will have Brent just queue up any questions that we have. So I know we have some going kind of in the chat box. So Brent,
I have a list. I have a list. I've been keeping a list, everybody. Don't worry.
Thank you.
So one thing in general, Dr. Brownlee, and you might not have this right now, and we could add this in a little bit, is just some of your references and resources in general that we can provide for people so they can do further research on all the great things that you've presented. So if you could, you don't need to comment on that, but that is just something I want to acknowledge that people have been asking for, just like some of those resources and everything like that. And if you can get those to me, we can talk afterwards about how to do that. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, I would love to share it. Absolutely.
So one of the questions we have is, actually, this is a very broad question, because in terms of terms, right, and what do we call people and what's okay, right? And I know I struggle with this myself, right? And I've started to use the term people of color, right, versus African American versus Black, right? And depending on where we are in our life, right, the words change and what we're allowed to say. So someone's actually asking, does that qualify as a microaggression also, like by using that term? And what is your thoughts on what terms should people feel comfortable using?
I think it's up to the individual person to determine that, right? And so I prefer the term Black. And the reason I prefer the term Black, it connects me with people that were part of the African diaspora. When I use the term African American, I think it disconnects me through boundaries, right? So when you look at the transatlantic slave trade, the first stop was in Brazil, then they worked their way up to the Caribbean, stopped in Mexico, and worked their way up to North America. So I like the term Black because it unifies me with others that are through the descendants of slavery as well. So I think it's up to the individual. So if someone comes up to me and say, I'm African American, I'm not going to be offensive, right? Or defensive and be like, no, that's not my name. I probably won't say nothing about it, but if we get to know each other, I would say I would prefer the term Black. And so I think we have to be open to the idea, number one, I may use this term, and how the person responds is up to how they respond. But everybody has different terms of how they want to be, referred to. I give you an example. I had a friend who I referred to as Latina. She didn't like that term. She was like, I prefer the term Chicana, right? And so it's like being able to be taught to say, okay, now I know what this person. I think the problem is this idea of everything is monolith or homogeneous, that you look at these group of people and you think that everybody in this group prefer these terms, but everybody prefers a different term. And we have to be open and teachable and understanding that people have different terms to be referred to. All right. So I think it's a microaggression when you're targeting the person, right? Versus says, hey, I have a question. What term would you prefer to be called? I think that's a different approach. When you come in humility and sincerity versus saying this is what you are, right? So I think that's the difference.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I guess along that same line, there's some questions like, Merriam-Webster, right? And everyone defines what is racism, right? But it keeps getting updated and changed.
Yeah.
What is your perspective on that and thoughts?
Well, racism has changed, right? And racism, the definition of racism always reflects our social political climate, right? And so Michelle Alexander does a great job of showing that in her textbook, The New Jim Crow. She breaks the African experience into three categories, right? Slavery, Jim Crow, and the prison industrial complex. And what she shows is that as policies change, the reference to one's melanin is used less, and they use dog whistle terms like state rights, they use dog whistle terms like urban, they use terms like that to get away from race. right? Because they want to focus more on policy because there's these ideologies that are already embedded with the term Black. So if I use the term welfare queen, a lot of times the Black woman will pop in our heads, right? But I don't have to say that she's Black. And so what you see over time is that racism, because it morphs because we create it. That's why it changes, right? The definition of gravity is probably the same because gravity is consistent and it's outside of our manipulation. So racism is within our manipulation, so it constantly changes. So when a policy changes, then the definition changes and it mutates. And so that's what we're constantly seeing all the time.
Wonderful.
Okay, great. Thank you. Give me just a moment here. There was the name of a book. Someone just posted there was the name of a book that you just mentioned. Oh, someone just put a new Jim Crow.
Yes, that's a must read. It's like a glass of water. You must read that text.
Yes.
You must read that text.
Okay. Sorry.
No.
There's lots going on today. So.
Yeah, lots of great comments. You know, I saw the comment from Eric Phillips. Eric, you're with us. Eric, do you want to share? I don't know if you mind going on camera with us. I know a lot of people are like, oh, please don't call on me, but I'm doing it. Yeah, I am. So Eric, if you don't mind going on camera with us, and maybe we could spotlight you. I'm curious about this diversity and inclusion certification program you're talking about. I love your comment, by the way. And I just would love to just kind of hear a little bit about what you gleaned from today's presentation with Dr. Brownlee. So Eric, do you want to share?
Sure. I can't get my camera working, but I am currently enrolled at Cornell, getting certification of diversity and inclusion. And one of our sessions, we did discuss macro and microaggressions. And I learned more today than I did in that class, taking that class. And I want to just say thank you for this opportunity because it really expounded and expanded my knowledge base as far as micro and macroaggressions. So,
thank you, Eric. I appreciate that. Humble. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I just saw that, Dr. Brownlee. I just thought you would appreciate the comment since we worked so hard on, Dr. Brownlee really worked hard on preparation. As you all know that present on this work, there's a tremendous amount of time that goes into preparation, right? To ensure that you have good context and information and content to be able to share with folks. So I thought you would appreciate that comment. So I also wanted to just, I know we've got a couple of questions. Do we have any other questions, Brent, that we wanted to go ahead and go through?
Yep, I'm working out with someone to see if they would like to come live. Nicholas, I'm private messaging him he had a few questions, but I figured we'd let him come live if you'd like.
Okay, so we can also, so Nicholas, if you would turn your camera on.
I have to have him do that. There you go. And also just put in your back of your mind, because we've had a couple of questions about how this relates to children and if a child is asking, and being just curious in general, and if those are microaggressions, which is interesting. So while we're waiting for Nicholas, maybe if he's able to join us, Dr. Brownlee, what do you think about that?
They definitely apply to children, and I think children learn more about microaggressions from their teachers than anything else, to be honest. And I share a story. I was in first grade. Miss Stevens, I remember, was the teacher, and she thought it would be cool to reenact Thanksgiving. And so she divided the class between Pilgrims and Indians. And so we making these hats and these feathers, and she's giving her, I remember the name she gave me was Big Bear. That was my Native American name. But what I noticed in the class, that all the students of colors were Native Americans in that class, and all the white kids were Pilgrims. So at the time, I kind of knew, even though I was in first grade, I was like, that's kind of wrong, but I didn't say nothing about it. So these microaggressions, we have to be understanding that K-12 education is really a social reproduction machine. Right? Their job is to reproduce social status, right? They're not really designed to have you challenge authority through critical thinking. So a lot of children that experience microaggressions actually come from school, right? The first time I heard the N-word was at school. I was told that I was not a good student at school. You know, I was told I would never graduate high school from school. So these things happen with children, and we have to understand when children inflict microaggressions on other children, they had to learn it from somebody else, maybe through the television or their parents at the dinner table. So they're just parrots, right? Or they're reflecting what they learned from their parents. So these microaggressions definitely come as early as children. I mean, come as early as K-12 or elementary school. And I share one more story with you. In 1983, October 3rd, 1983, I lived in a city called Griffin, Georgia. And there was a guy by the name of Timothy Coggins, C-O-G-G-I-N-S. He was lynched by the Ku Klux Klan in 1983, 10 minutes from where I lived. And I was 5 years old. And I used to always wonder why my mom was always up on ends about coming home when the lights come on. Make sure you come in the house when the lights come on. When we were thinking like, well, we live in the hood, ain't nobody gonna bother us. What she was telling us was, right, these macroaggressions, right, this lynching, these aggressions that are there, you need to get in the house because somebody was lynched 10 minutes from where we live in 1983. And so as children, you recognize these things even as a child. So we are socially constructed, right? You remember the first thing for mundane with the M-E-E-S, the first thing is mundane, right? Where your racial experiences is mundane, it's permanent, it's omnipresent, it's just a part of your life. And so that starts from as a youth all the way growing up.
Okay, great. We do have Nicholas here. He had a really quick question, and then we'll be closing down after that with some special announcements about things coming up. So Nicholas, take it away.
Can you introduce yourself and tell us who you're with, if you don't mind?
Oh yeah, I'm Nicholas. I'm with Phoenix College, I'm a faculty member.
Okay.
And I actually had a question about your research that you looked at with the American Psychological Association and the different strategies for self-care. You had mentioned resistance and maybe even activism as a successful strategy. And I kind of wanted to put it in context. If someone mounts resistance to these microaggressions or even macroaggressions, and that exists within a larger culture, structure, framework that's out there now, where there's kind of been like a counter movement against that, kind of a hostile environment, could that actually, I don't want to say backfire, but could that actually lead to more racial stress in that environment in which you mount a resistance to where the larger society is hostile, which I think we're seeing right now in the political climate?
Oh, absolutely. There's always some blowback, right? And I'm glad you brought it up. When you resist, right, against any form of power, there's going to be some kind of blowback, right? And so you definitely have to be aware of that. I'm glad you brought that up. But at the same time, I think that's a decision that you have to make, right? And I know this is an extreme example, but you know, MLK and many others knew that if I'm going to resist, that my house may be bombed or my children's life may be in danger. So you have to make that choice. Do I conform and just survive and maintain and deal with these stresses, which may not kill me today, but it'll kill me over long term? Or at the same time, right, do I resist and say, you know what, I got to be me and resist for the sake of my my psychological status, right? And so one of my heroes is Harriet Tubman, right? And so for her to escape slavery was a great feat, but to do the Underground Railroad 19 more times to save over 300 people was a choice that she made. So I believe also by resisting through these micro interventions, it also is a rallying cry for others to kind of coalesce around, right? To say, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. So yeah, there's going to be some pushback, definitely. But at the same time, it's like, what do you have to lose in a sense, right? And so like, I know personally for me years ago, I just made my mind up. I was like, I'm tired of being somebody's punching bag, right? I can't deal with this every day for some things I've been dealing with since I was a child. And somebody had put into the chat, my childhood experience micro and macroaggressions as early as pre-K, right? So you learn these things real early. And it's like, you know what? I reached a tipping point. So Nicholas, thanks for bringing it up, but it will be some pushback, definitely.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for answering our questions. Thank you to all of you for asking your questions. Keep the chat going. I love the dialogue, and I think it's really important. Dr. Brownlee, you are a breath of fresh air. I thank you for the time and the expertise. We'll give you our air clap. We'll give you our air clap, our jazz hands. We are so grateful. Thank you. I learned so much. I've got a whole notebook full of definitions. And like I said, this is work that I do. And my learning curve just really was quite steep. So looking forward to more work with you. And I really want to invite you all to keep the learning going. Don't stop here. We've had such an amazing dialogue series. This is dialogue number 3, and then we move into conference. So I would be remiss if I didn't just, all these dialogues that you guys have seen are the work of an amazing education team. I don't want you to, for one instance, you may see Dr. Scholar and I in front of the camera, but there are some amazing individuals that are right alongside us that have taken so much time on the education team to develop this content that you are seeing. You know, we've got members like Betty Thompson that has been working so hard on this, Tondra Richardson that is from UOP that has been helping us, Jackie Starks, just so many individuals, Victoria over at Edward Jones, you see Jackie over there, at least I see her over there, there's Jackie Starks, and these individuals are all volunteers that have spent so much time because they have the heart to do this work, to develop such important content. So hopefully you found as much meaning in it as we have, and you walked away today feeling like you've learned something, right? And you're going to learn even more because there are terms you want to go define and dig deeper in for yourself, right? That growth piece is really important. I would be remiss if I didn't thank the DLA Board of Directors. I know some were on earlier. We had Mr. Asen Otu from SRP that was joining us, and then Mr. Reed Despigaler is joining us. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Reed, who's going to tell you a little bit about your next opportunity to learn, which is our DLA conference. So Reed, could you tell us all about the upcoming conference? You want to unmute yourself, Reed? Can you unmute yourself? We might have to unmute him, Brent.
There we go. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much, Brent. Dr. Brownlee, thank you so much for the informative conversation today. Really enjoyed being part of it. And I really enjoyed listening and hearing new perspectives and, you know, taking that and continuing the conversation in my own life. So thank you so much for that. And as Joanna mentioned, this is part of a dialogue series that doesn't end, doesn't begin. It's, you know, we're right in it. And the conference is a 2-day virtual event to really set aside time for that. And I think kind of rooting ourselves in these conversations is important. 29th and 30th of October, it's going to be virtual, and it's going to be elegant and have that you know, feel that we always have at a DLA in-person conference. Many of our conference planning team are on this call. We are all part of this work. We work together to bring this to life, and we're putting the final touches on what's going to be a great event. Thursday and Friday, keynote in the morning, breakout workshop sessions with a deeper connection to conversations, informal lunch program, some vendor opportunities with partners, and then afternoon workshops as well. 2 days, different sets of conversations. You got to register. You can register on diversityleadershipalliance.org. There's a conference page, and you'll register through Eventbrite. The other way is if you are a sponsor from a participating sponsor organization, many are listed on your screen right now. You can register as part of that sponsorship, and you'll have a seat at the virtual table, if you will. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Happy to take questions about conference, and I'll put that email in chat. Turn it back over to Joanna. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. We've also added the conference registration link for you. There are still sponsorships available, and we're grateful to our change agent presenting sponsors, which this year we have 4 of them. We are grateful to our friends at SRP. Thank you so much for that. Mayo Clinic, USAA, and presenting sponsors at Cox Communication. And we've got our other sponsors listed there at the bottom. And then we move into the last 2 sessions for the year. So we're going to keep the dialogue going. The last 2 sessions of the year will happen in November. and December. So the next 2 sessions we have, oh, and Brent, actually, I'll just go to this really quickly and then have you end up with awards. So the last 2 sessions, November 19th, and then on December 10th, we're going to talk about radical equity, kind of moving closer to anti-racism. And then in November, we're going to talk about privilege. So make sure those 2 dates will come up for registration. And then to close this out, I would love for Dr. Scholar to talk a little bit about the awards nomination for conference. So Dr. Scholar, would you close us out with this?
Sure can, as I'm balancing a couple other things to get you all a bunch of really great links also in the chat. Here we go. So there's some great links in the chat for our conference tickets, our 4th discussion on privilege, and then our conscious radical equity, which will be our 5th one in December. And we have awards. So yes, thank you very much. And sorry, I will show myself. Here we go. There we are. So yes, we have our awards. Here's the great news. We have 5 different awards that we're giving. The bad news is I need your nominations by tomorrow at 5 o'clock. We've been, this has been open for about a month now, and it's really important that we get all of our diversity leaders, young and old, and I'm sorry for those like myself who say, no, I am over 30 and I still feel young, but we are making a decision to go over 30 for leaders and then young leaders under 30. And then we also have a nonprofit organization award for our inclusive workspace. And then also we have 2 for inclusive workplace for a small business, which is under 250 or over 250. If you go to our website, diversityleadershipalliance.org, right on that front page, there's a nice blue bar across. You can click that button. It'll take you to where our nomination form is. It's online. It's about 5 or 6 questions. It won't take you probably very long to do it, but we would greatly, greatly appreciate your nominations by tomorrow at 5 p.m. And with that, Joanna.
Thank you all so much for joining us. This has been Uncomfortable Conversations That Ignite Change with Diversity Leadership Alliance. With that, we bid you adieu. Have a fantastic rest of your day and be kind to each other. Thank you so much, everyone. Cheers.
Bye.